sound of a light breeze rusting through leaves, distant birds chirping peacefully, the sharp scratch of a match being struck, the crackle of a cigar being lit, long, slow exhale of smoke. He sat on this porch for more than 70 years, a glass of whiskey in one hand, a cigar in the other, smiling at the neighborhood children as they walked by. To the world, Richard Overton was the picture of peace, a man who had beaten time itself. Abrupt cut, deafening scream of a Japanese Zero dive bomber, massive explosion, tearing metal, panicked screams echoing. But when he closed his eyes, the peace vanished. He didn't see the Texas sunset. He saw the harbor. He saw the oil slick. And as Richard Overton once whispered to those who would listen, the water was red. Sound of heavy, thick waves slapping against a metal hull, the crackling of a massive fire, distant, muffled underwater sonar pings, fading into a low, somber musical drone. It is a heavy burden to remember what the rest of the world has forgotten. Richard Overton lived to be 112 years old. He was the oldest man in America. He saw the horse and buggy give way to the automobile. He saw the invention of the television, the moon landing, and the digital age. He outlived his wife, his friends, and even his doctors. But memory is a strange thing. It does not fade evenly. While the decades of peace might blur together, the moments of absolute terror remain sharp, crystalline, and terrifyingly present. For Richard, the timeline of the 20th century was not a straight line. It was a circle that always brought him back to a single morning in December, 1941. Most history books will tell you about the strategy of the attack. They will list the battleships, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the Utah. They will show you black and white maps of the flight paths of the Japanese Imperial Navy. But maps do not bleed. Textbooks do not smell of burning diesel and rotting flesh. To understand the story of Richard Overton, we have to look past the charming old man in the sunglasses. We have to peel back the layers of the local celebrity who was loved by presidents and neighbors alike, and find the young man underneath. A young black man from Austin, Texas, who joined the army looking for purpose and found himself standing at the gates of hell. He was a member of the 1887th Engineer Aviation Battalion, an all-black unit in a segregated army, serving a country that did not yet fully regard them as citizens. They were builders. Their job was to construct airfields, to pave the way for victory. But when they arrived in the Pacific, there was nothing to build, only things to survive. The paradise of Hawaii had been shattered. The sky, usually a brilliant blue, was choked with black smoke that hung over the islands for days, turning noon into twilight. The air was thick with the chemical taste of explosives. And then there was the water. In the interviews he gave in his final years, Richard often deflected the darkness with a joke or a smile. He preferred to talk about God or his secret to longevity. But occasionally, the mask would slip. The soldier would re-emerge. He would speak of the chaos of that arrival. He would speak of clearing the bodies from the wreckage. He would describe a scene so gruesome that it defied the comprehension of anyone who wasn't there. This film is not just a recounting of facts and dates. It is a descent into that sensory memory. Over the next hour and a half, we are going to retrace the journey of the 1887th. We are going to stand on the deck of that transport ship. We are going to look out at the horizon as the realization of war sets in. We will explore the psychological scars that a man carries for nearly 8 decades. How does one go on to live a happy life after seeing the ocean turn into a graveyard? How does a man find joy in the simple things, a cigar, a porch, a sunrise, after witnessing the industrial scale of death at Pearl Harbor? This is the untold story of the aftermath. This is the story of the silence that followed the explosions. This is the story of Richard Overton, the survivor, the witness, and the man who saw the water turn red. Sound of a single lonely trumpet playing taps in the distance, fading into the sound of a heartbeat. Silence. To understand the horror of what Richard Overton was about to see, one must first understand the man who was sailing toward it. Before the world knew him as a supercentenarian on a porch in Austin, Richard was already a man who had lived a full life. Born in 1906, he was 35 years old when he found himself on the deck of a transport ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. He was not a fresh-faced 18-year-old draftee who had never shaved. He was a grown man, a Texan who knew the value of a hard day's work and the texture of the soil in Bastrop County. He had spent his years working at a furniture store, hunting rabbits in the hills, and navigating the complex, unwritten rules of the Jim Crow South. He had enlisted in the army in September of 1940, a year before the war truly came to America, perhaps looking for stability, or perhaps looking for a change from the dust and heat of Texas. He could never have imagined that the change would come in the form of an apocalypse. He was assigned to the 1887th Engineer Aviation Battalion. To the military planners in Washington, this unit was a logistical asset, a group of men designed to build runways, clear jungles, and construct barracks. But to the society they served, they were something else. They were a segregated unit. All black enlisted men, commanded mostly by white officers. Even on the troop transport ship that cut through the deep blue swells of the Pacific, the color line was drawn as clearly as a border on a map. While they wore the same uniform and saluted the same flag, the men of the 1887th were quartered in the bowels of the ship, cramped into the hottest, loudest, and least desirable sections of the vessel. They were traveling to defend a democracy that did not yet allow them to vote, sailing to fight for a freedom they could not fully exercise at home. Yet, despite the systemic indignity, there was a camaraderie among them, a brotherhood forged in the shared experience of being black men in a white man's army, heading toward an unknown adventure in a tropical paradise called Hawaii. For days, the voyage was defined by the hypnotic rhythm of the engines and the endless, flat horizon. The Pacific Ocean is a beast of unfathomable size, and for a man from landlocked Texas, the sheer volume of water was a shock to the system. The mood on board was a mix of boredom and anticipation. Hawaii was rumored to be a posting of leisure, palm trees, warm breezes, and garrison duty. The soldiers played cards, smoked cigarettes, and speculated about the local women. There was an innocence to this time, a naive belief that they were simply moving from one base to another, far removed from the war raging in Europe. They were safe. The United States was not at war. The ocean was a barrier that no enemy could cross. That illusion shattered on a Sunday morning. The ship was days out from Pearl Harbor when the static-filled voice came over the ship's intercom system. It wasn't a drill sergeant barking orders, and it wasn't the usual announcement for mess call. The voice was tight, urgent, and trembling with a disbelief that infected every man who heard it. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet was burning. At first, there was silence, a heavy, confusing silence that hung in the humid air of the lower decks. Denial is the mind's first line of defense. Surely this was a training exercise. Surely this was a mistake. But as the hours passed, the reality set in. The ship's engines didn't slow down, they pushed harder. The routine of the voyage evaporated instantly. The casual atmosphere of the card games was replaced by a frantic, organized chaos. They were no longer travelers. They were targets. The captain ordered a complete blackout. No cigarettes on deck. No lights in the portholes. The ship began to zigzag, cutting sharp, erratic turns in the water to throw off the aim of Japanese submarines that might be lurking beneath the surface. The psychological shift for Richard and the men of the 1887th was profound. They had left San Francisco as laborers in uniform. Now, they were soldiers in a kill zone. Every shadow on the water looked like a periscope. Every cloud in the sky looked like a Zero fighter. For Richard, a man who was used to looking people in the eye, the threat was now invisible and omnipresent. He wasn't holding a rifle in a trench. He was trapped in a steel box floating on an ocean that had suddenly turned hostile. The innocence of the pre-war era didn't fade away gradually. It was murdered in a single radio broadcast. As they drew closer to the Hawaiian Islands, the tension on the ship became a physical weight. The men didn't sleep. How could they? They were sailing directly toward the site of a massacre. The rumors flew wild among the soldiers. Some said the Japanese had invaded the island. Others said the entire fleet was at the bottom of the sea. They had no smartphones, no news feeds, only the terrifying fragments of information that trickled down from the bridge. Richard Overton, 35 years old, sat in the darkness of the hold, listening to the groan of the ship's metal, wondering if he would ever see Texas again. Then came the visual confirmation. Long before they saw the green peaks of Oahu, they saw the stain on the sky. It was a black smudge on the horizon, unnatural and persistent. It wasn't a storm cloud, it was smoke, thick, oily smoke rising from the funeral pyres of the battleships. As the transport ship slowed its approach, the smell hit them. It was a sickeningly sweet, metallic odor, a mix of burning bunker C fuel oil, melted rubber, and charred wood. It was the scent of destruction. carrying on the trade winds to greet them. The chatter on the deck died down completely. There were no more jokes. No more complaints about the food. As the coastline came into view, the men of the 1887th Engineer Aviation Battalion crowded the rails, staring in silence. They were entering a crime scene. The beautiful tropical paradise they had been promised had been ripped open, and as the ship glided toward the harbour mouth, Richard Overton gripped the railing, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The calm voyage was over. The hell was just beginning. The transition from the open ocean to the mouth of Pearl Harbor was a descent into a surreal, waking nightmare. As the transport ship carrying the 1887th Engineer Aviation Battalion cut through the waves, closing the distance to Oahu, the men were bracing themselves for a tropical vista. They had seen the postcards. They knew to expect emerald mountains, turquoise waters, and swaying palms, but the island that awaited them was shrouded in a darkness that defied the midday sun. The first warning was not visual but olfactory. Long before the coastline was distinct, the wind shifted, carrying with it a scent so heavy and malignant that it seemed to coat the back of the throat. It was a thick, acrid cocktail of bunker C fuel oil, the lifeblood of the Navy's battleships, burning at intense temperatures. Underneath that chemical stench lay something more primal and disturbing, the smell of seared flesh. For Richard Overton, a man who had grown up close to the land in Texas, who knew the scent of a barbecue pit and the smell of a brush fire, this was different. This was the smell of a city burning. This was the smell of an industrial catastrophe mixed with a slaughterhouse. It made the men on the deck gag and pull their handkerchiefs over their faces, a futile attempt to filter out the air of death that now surrounded them. As the ship drew closer, the horizon ceased to look like a boundary between sea and sky and began to look like a bruise. A massive, monolithic column of black smoke rose from the harbour, expanding as it climbed, until it blotted out the sun. It cast a strange, artificial twilight over the water, turning the bright Pacific afternoon into a gloomy grey dusk. The smoke was static and heavy, fed by the fires that were still raging days after the initial attack. It rained down a fine, greasy ash that settled on the white uniforms of the sailors and the fatigues of the soldiers, staining them before they even set foot on land. The psychological impact of this visual was instantaneous. It signaled that the sanctuary was gone. The fortress of American power in the Pacific had not just been breached, it had been incinerated. Richard stood at the railing, squinting against the grit in the air, watching the paradise of Hawaii dissolve into a grayscale hellscape. When the transport ship finally navigated the channel and entered Pearl Harbor proper, the full scale of the devastation revealed itself. It was a graveyard of giants. The harbor, usually a picture of organized military might with rows of pristine grey hulls, was now a chaotic junk pile of twisted steel. Richard Overton looked out and saw the impossible. The USS Oklahoma, a vessel that displaced nearly 30,000 tons, had been capsized. It lay upside down like a dead whale, its massive propellers exposed to the air, a humiliating and terrifying sight for men who believed the Navy was invincible. The sheer physics of it was hard to comprehend. The amount of force required to flip a battleship was beyond anything these men had encountered. Further along Battleship Row, the USS Arizona was still burning. It had been days since the bomb pierced its magazine, yet the fires refused to die. The ship had settled into the mud, its superstructure twisted and melted like wax. It was less a ship and more a tomb, still holding over 1,000 men inside its iron belly. For Richard, seeing these leviathans destroyed was a shock to the system that no training could have prepared him for. These ships were the symbols of American strength, the steel guarantors of their safety, and they had been snapped like twigs. The sight stripped away any remaining sense of security. If these steel mountains could die, what chance did a flesh-and-blood man from Austin have? The atmosphere on the deck was one of suffocating paranoia. The attack had happened days ago, but no one knew if the Japanese fleet had truly left. Rumors ran rampant that a third wave of bombers was on its way, or that enemy submarines had slipped into the harbor amidst the chaos. Every flash of sunlight reflecting off a piece of floating debris looked like a periscope. Every shadow of a seabird passing overhead made heads snap up in terror, eyes searching for the red sun insignia on a fuselage. The men of the 1887th were combat engineers, not anti-aircraft gunners. They felt naked, exposed on the slow-moving transport ship, drifting through a kill zone where the smoke of the dead provided the only cover. They gripped their rifles with white-knuckled intensity, scanning the smoky sky, waiting for the high-pitched whine of a dive bomber that might signal the end of their lives before they had even stepped off the boat. The confusion was total. There were no clear orders, only the visual evidence of a massacre and the terrifying uncertainty of whether the slaughter was truly over. The psychological impact of war is often discussed in terms of strategy or loss of territory, but for the individual soldier, trauma is recorded in flashes of sensory input, specific images that burn through the brain's defenses and lodge themselves permanently in the memory. For Richard Overton, standing on the precipice of World War II, that image was the water of Pearl Harbor. As his unit disembarked and moved toward the harbor's edge, the abstraction of the attack vanished, replaced by a visceral, sickening reality. The Pacific Ocean, known for its deep crystalline blues and turquoise shallows, had ceased to exist. In its place was a substance that defied nature. The water was not merely dirty or polluted, it was a transformed element. It was red. This was not a metaphorical description or a trick of the light caused by the fires raging above. It was a literal, chemical reality born from the violence of the event. To understand what Richard saw, one must understand the anatomy of the disaster. The battleships anchored in the harbor were filled with hundreds of thousands of gallons of bunker C fuel oil, a thick, tar-like substance used to power the massive engines of the fleet. When the torpedoes and bombs tore open the steel hulls of the USS Arizona, the USS West Virginia, and the USS Oklahoma, they didn't just let water in, they let the lifeblood of the ships out. This black, viscous sludge poured into the harbor, coating the surface in a suffocating blanket. But the oil did not sit alone. It mixed with the chemical foam used desperately by firefighters to quell the infernos, creating a gray-white slurry. And then, tragically, it mixed with the blood. The scale of human loss at Pearl Harbor was industrial. Over 2,400 Americans died, many of them violently torn apart by explosions or shredded by shrapnel. The sheer volume of blood released into the harbor basin was enough to chemically alter the appearance of the tide. Richard Overton, looking out at the bay, saw this grotesque marbleization. The black oil swirled with the crimson blood, creating a thick, red-black tapestry that bobbed sluggishly against the docks. It didn't look like water anymore. It looked like the floor of a slaughterhouse that had been flooded. In his later years, when asked about that day, Richard would often pause, his voice dropping an octave, and simply say, "You couldn't see the water. It was red." That sentence contained the weight of his entire war. It was the moment he realized that the rules of civilization had been suspended. Floating within this red sludge were the bodies. This was the sight that tested the sanity of every man who witnessed it. They were not neatly arranged rows of fallen soldiers like one might see in a cemetery. They were the debris of chaos. Men were floating face down, their white navy uniforms stained black with oil and red with blood, making them look like indistinct shadows. Some were burned beyond recognition, their skin charmed black by the intense heat of the fires that had raged across the oil-slicked surface. The fire on the water was a particularly cruel horror. Men who had jumped from the burning ships to save themselves found that the water itself was aflame, the oil catching fire and trapping them in a burning sea. Richard watched as recovery boats navigated through this carnage, their propellers churning the red mixture, turning up more bodies that had sunk below the surface. It was a scene of absolute indignity. These were young men, some only 18 or 19 years old, who had been eating breakfast or sleeping just hours before. Now they were part of the refuse of the harbor. Richard saw limbs separated from torsos, drifting aimlessly in the current. He saw sailors frozen in their final moments of agony, trapped in the twisted wreckage that protruded from the red water. The shock of seeing mass death is profound, but the shock of seeing it in this state, dismembered, burned, and coated in industrial slime, is shattering. It stripped away any romantic notion of glory in war. There was no glory here. There was only biology and physics, the fragility of the human body against the uncaring force of high explosives. But the horror was not limited to the eyes. The sound of Pearl Harbor in the aftermath was a symphony of suffering that Richard Overton could never unhear. We often imagine the sound of war as the boom of cannons or the rattle of machine guns. But by the time Richard stood at the water's edge, the planes were gone. The dominant sounds were far more haunting. It was the sound of metal groaning. The massive ships, weighing tens of thousands of tons, were settling into the mud, their steel frames twisting and buckling under the stress of heat and gravity. It sounded like the ships themselves were crying out in pain, a deep, resonant screeching that echoed across the harbor. Underneath the mechanical sounds were the human ones. Even days after the attack, the harbor was not silent. There were the shouts of the rescue crews, the barking of orders, and the sobbing of survivors who had made it to shore only to watch their shipmates die. But the most terrifying sound was the one that came from the water itself. Inside the overturned hull of the USS Oklahoma, and deep within the bowels of the sunken USS West Virginia, men were still alive. Trapped in air pockets in the pitch-black darkness, upside down and disoriented, sailors were banging on the metal hulls with wrenches, hammers, or their bare hands. Clang, clang, clang. It was a rhythmic, desperate SOS signaling that they were alive, slowly suffocating or waiting for the water to rise. Richard, standing on the shore, could hear this tapping. It was a sound that drove men mad. The knowledge that mere feet away, through a wall of steel, men were alive and dying slowly, and there was nothing the engineers on the shore could do to reach them in time. The combination of these sensory inputs, the smell of the burning oil, the sight of the red, viscous water, the floating bodies, and the relentless tapping from the sunken ships, created a psychological imprint that Richard carried for the next 77 years. He was an engineer, a builder, a man who fixed things. But he could not fix this. He could not unmix the blood from the oil. He could not raise the ships. He could only witness. This sense of helplessness, combined with the sheer graphic violence of the scene, forged a trauma that was silent but deep. When he looked at that water, he didn't just see the aftermath of an attack. He saw the fragility of life. He saw how quickly a human being could be reduced to matter, floating in a tide of red. It was a lesson in mortality that no philosophy book could teach, and it was the moment Richard Overton truly became a soldier of the Second World War. He realized then that he wasn't fighting for a flag or an ideal. He was fighting to keep himself and his brothers out of that red water. The transition from witness to participant is one of the most jarring psychological shifts a soldier can undergo. For the first few hours, Richard Overton and the men of the 1887th Engineer Aviation Battalion were spectators to a catastrophe, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the destruction before them. But in the military, paralysis is not an option. Orders came down through the chain of command, snapping the men out of their trance. They were engineers, builders, and problem solvers. Usually, their mandate was to construct airfields, pave runways, and erect barracks. But on this day, and for the grueling weeks that followed, their job description changed. They became the custodians of the dead. They were ordered to descend from the relative safety of the shore and the transport ships into the carnage itself. The mission was recovery and cleanup, a sanitized term for a task that was anything but sanitary. They had to enter the red water. This was the moment the horror became tactile. Standing on the dock, the oil and blood were a visual nightmare. Down in the water, they became a physical enemy. As Richard stepped off the solid ground and waded into the harbor, the substance that engulfed his boots and legs was heavy and suffocating. Bunker C fuel oil is not like gasoline. It is thick, viscous, and sticky, akin to molasses or tar. It clung to everything it touched. As the men moved through the waist-deep muck, the oil coated their uniforms, turning the fabric into heavy black lead. It splashed onto their skin, clogging their pores and burning their eyes. The smell, which had been bad from a distance, was now overpowering, a chemical stench that coated the inside of their lungs and made every breath a labor. But the oil was not the only thing in the water. As they waded forward, bumping into floating debris, crates, suitcases, pieces of hull, they also bumped into the soft, yielding forms of the fallen. The recovery of the bodies was a task that required a suspension of humanity. To do the job, Richard and his unit had to turn off the part of their brains that registered the dead as people. They had to view them as weight, as objects to be retrieved, but the reality of the task made detachment nearly impossible. The oil made everything slippery. Trying to lift a waterlogged body, coated in slick grease, onto a skiff or a stretcher, was a chaotic, fumbling physical struggle. They had to grip tightly, often holding onto limbs or clothing that would tear away in their hands. The intimacy of this contact was traumatizing. Richard was physically touching the result of the violence he had only just escaped. He was handling men who were his own age, men who looked like they could have been his brothers or cousins, now reduced to silent, heavy burdens. The water, red with blood and black with oil, splashed onto Richard's face as he worked, a baptism in the gore of a war he hadn't yet fired a shot in. Compounding this physical misery was the omnipresent threat of death. The attack on Pearl Harbor had come in waves, and intelligence at the time suggested that the Japanese fleet was still lurking just over the horizon, preparing for a final crushing blow. The men of the 1887th were not working in a secure rear area, they were working in a bullseye. Every engineer was ordered to keep his weapon on him at all times. Richard worked with his M1 Garand rifle slung across his back or propped precariously against a piece of wreckage within arm's reach. The weight of the steel and wood against his spine was a constant reminder that he was a soldier first and a laborer second. The paranoia was suffocating. Every time a piece of metal groaned under the shifting tides or a crane dropped a load on the docks, heads would snap up, eyes scanning the smoke-choked sky for the silhouette of a Zero. There were false alarms, sirens that would wail suddenly, sending the men scrambling out of the water and into the mud, clutching their rifles, hearts hammering against their ribs, waiting for bombs that never fell. The psychological toll of this start-stop terror was immense. They were trying to respect the dead while terrifyingly afraid of joining them. They were exhausted, filthy and terrified, yet they had to keep moving. The sheer physical exertion of wading through sludge, lifting heavy debris and carrying bodies, burned calories at a rapid rate, but few had the appetite to eat. The smell of the harbor clung to their hands even after they scrubbed them with harsh lye soap and gasoline. The food in the mess kits tasted like oil. The water in their canteens seemed to smell of smoke. The nightmare had invaded their senses so completely that there was no escape, even when they were technically on break. Yet in the midst of this Dantean scene, a strange social phenomenon occurred. The United States Army in 1941 was strictly segregated. Black soldiers like Richard were often relegated to support roles, treated as second-class citizens, and kept separate from their white counterparts. But inside the burning harbor, the segregation laws of the Jim Crow South held no power. The oil didn't care about rank or race. A white sailor pulled from the water was covered in the same black sludge as the black engineer pulling him out. In the chaos of the recovery, the rigid social hierarchy dissolved into a desperate brotherhood of survival. Richard found himself working shoulder to shoulder with white soldiers, Marines and sailors. There were no salutes, no yes sirs or no sirs, just grunted commands. Grab his legs, lift on 3, watch out for that cable. For a brief window of time, the shared trauma leveled the playing field. They were all just men covered in filth trying to bring the dead home. Richard saw white officers weeping openly. He saw black privates taking charge of chaotic situations. The utter devastation of the American fleet had stripped away the pretenses of society, leaving only the raw human core. They were united by the specific, horrible knowledge of what a human body weighs when it is dead. They were bonded by the shared struggle to scrub the oil from their skin at night, a task that often took hours and left their skin raw and bleeding. This brotherhood of the doomed was fleeting. Once the crisis passed, the walls of segregation would go back up. But in the heat of the moment, inside that red water, Richard Overton was not just a colored soldier in the eyes of the men around him. He was a lifeline. He was a brother in arms. And he was working harder than he ever had in his life, driven by a silent promise to the men floating in the water, that they would not be left behind in the muck, that they would be treated with dignity, even if it meant he had to carry the weight of their death on his own shoulders for the rest of the century. The sun eventually set on Pearl Harbor, but it did not bring peace. In any other timeline, a Hawaiian sunset would have been a moment of breathtaking beauty, a gradient of oranges and purples bleeding into the Pacific. But on this night, the sunset was merely a transition from a visible hell to an invisible one. For Richard Overton and the men of the 1887th Engineer Aviation Battalion, the arrival of night marked the beginning of a different kind of torture. The physical labor of the day, the hauling of debris, the scrubbing of oil, the recovery of bodies, had pushed their bodies to the brink of collapse. Muscles screamed, skin burned from chemical exposure, and stomachs turned inside out from the stench. By all biological rights, They should have passed out the moment they stopped moving. But sleep was an impossibility. As the light faded, the adrenaline that had fueled them through the shock of the day began to recede, leaving behind a cold, raw vulnerability. The reality of their situation was no longer kept at bay by the distraction of work. Now, there was nothing to do but lie in the dirt and think. The order came down swiftly and with absolute severity. Blackout. Total, uncompromising darkness. The military command was terrified that the Japanese fleet was still lurking in the darkness, waiting for a single lit match or the glow of a flashlight to reveal a target for a night raid. Every bulb was unscrewed, every window covered, every cigarette lighter banned. The darkness that descended on Oahu was not the natural darkness of a rural night. It was a suffocating, artificial void. The smoke from the still-burning battleships hung low over the island, blocking out the moon and the stars, creating a canopy of soot that turned the world into a tomb. For Richard, lying in a makeshift bivouac near the airfield, this blindness was terrifying. A soldier relies on his eyes to identify threats. Strip that away, and the imagination takes over. Every rustle of the palm fronds sounded like footsteps. Every shift in the wind sounded like the distant hum of an airplane engine. The darkness transformed the landscape from a tropical island into a claustrophobic cage, where death could be standing 3 feet away and you wouldn't know it until the bayonet pierced your skin. But the darkness was not silent. If the eyes were useless, the ears became hypersensitive, amplifying the soundtrack of the aftermath. And there was one sound, above all others, that defined the trauma of that night. It was not the crackle of the fires, which were slowly being contained. It was a rhythmic, metallic sound. Clang, clang, clang. At first, the men on the shore tried to rationalize it. Loose rigging hitting a mast, a piece of debris banging against a dock, but the rhythm was too irregular to be mechanical, yet too persistent to be random. It was the sound of metal on metal. It was coming from the harbor. Specifically, it was coming from the overturned hull of the USS Oklahoma and the sunken superstructure of the USS West Virginia. The realization swept through the camp like a contagion. It was the sailors. Hundreds of men had been trapped inside the ships when they capsized or sank. They were alive, sealed in air pockets within the watertight compartments of the steel leviathans. They were hanging upside down in the pitch black, cold water rising around them, breathing air that was slowly running out, and they were banging on the hull with wrenches, hammers, or whatever heavy object they could find. They were signaling to the world that they were still there. They were begging to be cut out. For Richard Overton, lying on his back in the dirt, staring up into the smoke-choked blackness, this sound was a form of psychological torture that no training could withstand. He was an engineer. His instinct was to fix, to build, to help. But he knew, as did every man on that beach, that there was nothing they could do. The torches needed to cut through the thick armor plating of a battleship would consume the oxygen inside the compartments instantly, suffocating the men they were trying to save. Or worse, the sparks would ignite the oil slicks and fuel vapors, incinerating them. They were helpless. They had to lie there in the dark and listen to their brothers in arms slowly die, frantic beat by frantic beat. Clang, clang, clang. It was a Morse code of the damned. It went on for hours. It went on for days. Some survivors say it went on for weeks, growing fainter and fainter until the last hammer dropped. That sound rewired Richard's brain. It stripped away the illusion of safety that civilization provides. It taught him that the line between life and a horrific, claustrophobic death is razor-thin and entirely arbitrary. Why was he on the shore breathing fresh air while those boys were suffocating in a steel box? There was no answer. There was only the tapping. It was in this crucible of helplessness that a new habit was forged, one that would stay with Richard for the next 77 years. He reached out in the darkness and wrapped his hand around the cold wood and steel of his M1 Garand rifle. He pulled it close, sliding it into the sleeping bag with him, the barrel resting near his shoulder, his finger hovering near the trigger guard. In a world where battleships could flip over and trap men like rats, where the sky could rain fire without warning, and where the darkness hid monsters, the rifle was the only tangible piece of control he possessed. It was a metal talisman against the chaos. If the Japanese came out of the jungle, he would be ready. If the world decided to end tonight, he would meet it with a round in the chamber. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in a state of hypervigilance, eyes wide open in the dark, listening to the dying beats of the Oklahoma, his grip on the rifle tightening with every clang. This was the birth of the warrior monk who would later sit on his porch in Austin with a pistol by his side. The neighbors thought it was just a quirk of an old Texan man. They didn't know that Richard was still guarding against the darkness of 1941. They didn't know that in his mind, the sun had never fully risen after that first night in Pearl Harbor. He survived the night, but the silence he craved never returned. It was replaced by a vigilance that would outlast the war, outlast the peace, and carry him all the way to his 112th year. The boy from Texas died that night. The survivor was born, holding a gun, waiting for the dawn that felt like it would never come. For decades, the water in Richard Overton's mind remained still. He returned to Texas in 1945, a 39-year-old man who had circumnavigated the globe and stared into the abyss of human cruelty. He took off the uniform, hung up the rifle, and did what an entire generation of men was expected to do. He went back to work. He built a house in East Austin, a modest structure on Hamilton Avenue that he constructed with his own hands, board by board, nail by nail. He planted trees. He got a job at a furniture store. He went to church on Sundays. To his neighbors, he was just Richard, the friendly man who always had a wave for passers-by. He didn't speak of the Pacific. He didn't gather the neighborhood children around to tell ghost stories about the jungle or the sound of torpedoes hitting steel. Like millions of other veterans, he took the memories of the red water, wrapped them in a heavy shroud of silence, and buried them deep in the basement of his subconscious. This silence was not born of shame. It was born of an inability to translate the experience. How does one explain the smell of Pearl Harbor to a neighbor complaining about the heat? How does one describe the texture of oil mixed with blood to a customer deciding between two sofas? The reality of the war was so extreme, so visceral, that it felt incompatible with the polite, segregated society of post-war America. So, Richard kept the red water to himself. It became a secret burden, a dark jewel that he carried in his pocket every day. He lived through the 1950s, the civil rights movement of the 60s, the moon landing, and the technological boom of the 90s, all while holding on to that frozen image of 1941. The world moved on. The wreckage was cleared from the harbor. The ships were raised or memorialized. The water in Oahu turned blue again, pristine and inviting for tourists. But for Richard, the water never truly cleared. In the quiet moments, in the space between heartbeats, the red tide would wash back in. However, trauma is a strange architect. It destroys some men, crumbling their foundations until they collapse under the weight of their own memories. But for Richard Overton, the trauma of Pearl Harbor became a paradoxical source of fuel. The proximity to industrial-scale death wired his brain with a ferocious, unyielding appreciation for life. When you have seen 2,000 young men wiped from the earth in a single morning, the concept of saving yourself for later becomes a cruel joke. Richard realized that tomorrow is not a promise, it is a gamble. This realization birthed the philosophy that would make him famous in his final years. The whiskey, the 12 cigars a day, the butter pecan ice cream, these were not vices of a careless man. They were the sacraments of a survivor. Doctors would lecture him for decades. They told him the smoking would kill him. They told him the alcohol would rot his liver. They told him to slow down, to be careful, to act his age. Richard outlived every single one of them. He buried the doctors who told him to stop smoking. Why? Because Richard understood something they didn't. He understood that stress kills faster than tobacco. He understood that the real poison is the fear of dying, not the joy of living. Every puff of a cigar was a breath that the boys in the USS Oklahoma never got to take. Every sip of whiskey in the evening sun was a toast to the men who drowned in the oil. He wasn't abusing his life. He was consuming it voraciously, scraping every ounce of pleasure from the bottom of the bowl, because he knew exactly how fragile the bowl was. His hedonism was a form of defiance. It was his way of looking back at the red water and saying, "You didn't get me. I am still here. I am still dancing." And then there was the porch. If Pearl Harbor was the site of his trauma, the front porch on Hamilton Avenue was his fortress of peace. For over 70 years, that porch was his command center. It was the antithesis of the harbor. The harbor was chaotic, loud, uncontrollable, and filled with death. The porch was static, quiet, controlled, and filled with life. He spent hours there, watching the world change from the safety of his chair. He watched the dirt roads become paved. He watched the cars change from Model Ts to Teslas. He watched the neighborhood children grow up, grow old, and have children of their own. The porch was his anchor. It was the place where he could control the perimeter, where the only smoke came from his Tampa Sweet cigars, not from burning battleships. It was here, in the safety of his violently acquired old age, that the silence finally began to crack. In his final years, as he crossed the threshold of 105, then 110, the world suddenly wanted to know his secret. They came with cameras and microphones, expecting sage advice about vegetables and exercise. Instead, they found a man who drove his pickup truck until he was 106 and flirted with the nurses. And as the fame grew, Richard finally felt safe enough to open the vault. He began to talk about the water. He told the reporters, he told the documentarians, and he told the President of the United States. The water was red, he said. He didn't say it with horror anymore. He said it with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who has made peace with his ghosts. Sharing the memory seemed to lighten the load, as if he were finally distributing the weight of that day onto the shoulders of a nation that had long forgotten the specifics of the sacrifice. The beauty of Richard Overton's legacy is not just that he lived a long time, but that he lived through the entire arc of the modern American experience. He was a man who was treated as a second-class citizen, forced to sleep in the bowels of a ship, who lived to be honored by the first black president in the Oval Office. He saw the world break, and he saw it rebuild. But until his final breath in December 2018, the connection remained. The 112-year-old man on the porch was holding hands with the 35-year-old soldier in the harbor. The joy of the former was made possible by the horror of the latter. He carried the image of the red water so that we wouldn't have to. He remembered the smell of the burning oil so that we could smell the fresh air of freedom without thinking about the cost. In the end, Richard Overton didn't just survive Pearl Harbor, he defeated it. He took the ugliest image imaginable and buried it under a mountain of smiles, whiskey, and cigar smoke, proving that while war can stain the water red, it cannot drown the human spirit. On December 27, 2018, the rocking chair on Hamilton Avenue finally stopped moving. Richard Overton, the man who had cheated death in the Pacific and outrun time itself for more than a century, quietly slipped away. He was 112 years old. When the news broke, headlines around the world celebrated the oldest man in America, the whiskey-drinking, cigar-smoking icon who charmed a nation. But for those who truly understood his story, his passing meant something far profounder than the loss of a beloved centenarian. It marked the extinguishing of a living light that had illuminated one of the darkest corners of human history. With his death, the direct, living memory of the red water of Pearl Harbor was gone. There were no more eyes left that had seen the harbor burning from that specific vantage point. There was no longer a voice that could describe in the first person the precise smell of the oil and the silence of the aftermath. The library of his mind had burned down, taking the raw footage of 1941 with it. It is easy to look at Richard's life as a triumph of longevity, a quirky story of good genes and good luck. But that simplifies the sheer magnitude of his existence. His life was not just long, it was heavy. For 77 years, every time he lit a cigar, every time he sat in the sun, he was performing an act of resistance against the memory of that water. He had seen the absolute worst of what humanity can do to itself, the industrial slaughter, the racial hatred, the mechanical indifference of war. He saw the water turn red with the blood of boys who had their whole lives ahead of them. And yet, he chose not to let that color paint the rest of his world. He chose to build a house. He chose to love his neighbors. He chose to laugh. This was his greatest victory. He did not let the horror of the 1887th Engineer Aviation Battalion define him, but he never let it go either. He carried it so that we wouldn't have to feel the weight of it. In the end, we must ask ourselves, what is the legacy of a man like Richard Overton? Is it the medals? Is it the presidential photo ops? Is it the cigars? No. His legacy is the perspective he offered us. He stood as a bridge between two eras. He held the hand of the past with its brutal, bloody reality, and the hand of the present with its often taken-for-granted freedom. When he told us the water was red, he wasn't trying to scare us. He was trying to remind us of the cost of the ground we walk on. He was telling us that the peace we enjoy on our own front porches was purchased by men who had to wade through hell to secure it. He was a sentinel who stood watch for 7 decades, ensuring that the men who died in the harbour were never truly lost as long as he drew breath. As we say goodbye to Richard Overton, we are left with an image that is both simple and profound. Picture him one last time on that porch. The evening sun is low, casting long shadows across the Austin street. He strikes a match. The flame flares up, brief and bright, just like a human life against the backdrop of eternity. He lights his cigar and takes a long, slow draw. The smoke curls out of his mouth thick and white. It rises into the air, dancing in the breeze. For a moment, it looks like the smoke that rose over Oahu in 1941. It looks like the fog of war. But then, the wind catches it. The smoke thins out. It drifts higher and higher, becoming wispy and transparent, until finally it disappears completely into the clear blue sky. The air is clean again. The water is blue again. The pain is gone. Richard Overton has finally put down his rifle. He has left the harbour. He has gone to a place where there is no oil, no fire, and no red water. He has gone to join the boys he left behind so many years ago. But while the smoke has faded, the truth remains. He witnessed the darkness so that we could live in the light. He carried the nightmare so that we could dream. And as the screen fades to black, we are left with the silence and the memory of a man who saw the world end and decided to smile anyway. He remembered so we wouldn't have to.